Good afternoon, and welcome to the public meeting of the Board of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts. This is a rather impromptu follow-on to our last meeting, which was the regularly scheduled Tuesday monthly meeting, but we had one agenda item we were unable to get to as a result of extenuating circumstances on Sleeper Street. So here we are a couple of weeks later. This does not supersede the next meeting, which is regularly scheduled second Tuesday in November as well. I'm Noni Lasso, the chair of the board. Welcome to the meeting and thank you all for joining. I'll just say a few words to begin and then I will turn it over to the commissioner and her team. I first want to acknowledge that the secretary had a very last minute unavoidable conflict. He will not be joining us. The commissioner and I are scheduled, however, to debrief with him tomorrow morning. So we will keep in close touch. Big picture, I just, for those of you on the board, this sort of follows my message a few weeks ago, which is that I'm grateful to the commissioner and the associate commissioner, Sean Reynolds, for a sort of new strategy around fiscal, which is to say, as I mentioned to all of you, we'll have sort of a regular engagement on the spending vis-a-vis the priorities and of course the circumstances, right? So big picture, that was a shift we were aiming for, to have part of the monthly meeting a discussion about the spending and the priorities. I think the public health circumstances further drive the need for this very ongoing conversation. And to that end, I thought I would just say a couple of things for us to consider as a board. First of all, I think we want to pay very close attention in framing up this conversation to the impending next wave of cases of COVID. That is to say, if you look at some of the models that the epidemiologists are producing, we will very soon be in the very same situation as we were last spring. And perhaps medically, we are in a better position to handle it. But from an early education and care perspective, we will be in many ways in many of the same dilemmas. We will confront many of the same dilemmas, and we will need to think hard about how to continue to support the field as it aims to do its work. And we can certainly imagine a lot of scenarios. But on the fiscal side, what I have been thinking a lot about is I think our work ought to be guided by three principles. And that is one of tremendous flexibility, right? One that is guided by really our mission to support children and families in Massachusetts. And with that in mind, the third principle, in my view, if we look at the last few months and particularly at the caseloads and the costs and the losses associated with COVID, I think our third principle ought to be to get every single penny we can out to supporting the field during what is basically a very sustained crisis, right? Maybe we had a reprieve over the summer. The field did not have a reprieve. They were trying to rebuild and figure themselves out and support families. Big picture, epidemiologically, we did. We are no longer in that situation anyway, epidemiologically, and it's very expensive to educate and care for kids during COVID. We also want to be recognized once again that the field has suffered tremendous financial losses over the last many months. So I think our last principle ought to be that we, coupled with the creativity and the flexibility, we got to try to get everything we can in terms of resources, dollars out to the field during this time. So I will turn it over to the commissioner and her team and look forward to this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Lasso. And I want to thank you all for your patience and partnership as we walk through what is not only a new way of looking at the budget, but a new context in which all of us will have to feel our ways through in this very unprecedented moment. And so on that note, for those of you following at home, we have pulled out the slides that were for that agenda item that we did not get to, but they're the same ones available in the full deck online. So if people are following along, it's the same slides, but it is just the final component of them. So When we were talking about the budget and spending update this time around, we wanted to start with what is more of capturing a normal cycle and highlight where we are right now on that cycle. And then obviously, since we had the board meeting, the governor did propose a revised proposal to the legislature. So we can highlight a few of those things as we walk through there. But really looking at a traditional cycle like we started last year had us discussing priorities for FY21. You all passed a memo that set forth those priorities with funding increases or allocations that were recommended. Those were reflected in the governor's proposed House 2 that went in January, as you will remember, that he did reflect your priorities that were recommendations in there. Normally, what would have happened is the legislature, as we were starting to have conversations around that prior to COVID, they would be debating that and then come back in April or May, and make it through the budget process. We would have a budget by July and be working through a spending plan for the year on that. And then we would start the conversation over. Once we had a spending plan and how we'd spend, we'd talk about what that leads to the next year. If you go to the next slide, you can see where we sort of halted this year, which is where we were interrupted between the governor's budget and the legislature's discussion and negotiations over the budget. And so as we headed into July, and normally we'd be discussing FY22 priorities right now, we're still working through how those FY21 priorities you all set, which still very much hold true to what we want for the system, need to be negotiated in the midst of changing revenue projections and changing processes and context given COVID. And so given that where we are, we wanted to take a chance to look through what we've done to help negotiate this year of unexpected challenges, and in particular, how that relates to where the funding priorities for FY21 that the board reflected. And then as we sort of negotiate the year ahead, understanding what we know and don't know and how we can structure a conversation over the course of the year that ensures that our spending, which will look different and be made very different decisions this year than it has been in the past years at very different cadence and time frame, still allow us to stay true to the priorities and the objectives and the North Star, and making compromises that don't take us away from that when we look at our spending and allocations for the year. So mostly wanted you all to just understand, like, thinking through the cycle where this was disrupted. Now, right now, where we are, as well as the governor did sort of pick up that revised legislative proposal or budget proposal for the legislature that would have normally happened in January, sort of revised that. And so here we are in October, so starting the process over at halfway, or a quarter of the way through the fiscal year. So just wanted to contextualize why this year looks different, where we are. And I think that through this process, as I said, with the patience and persistence and partnership to feel our way through it, wanted everyone to sort of see where we are. So moving on to the next slide, wanted to make sure that we were also grounding ourselves and talking through the board priorities that you set. I wanted an opportunity to reflect on what is still relevant about these and how we are thinking about it before we go into some of the ways we've responded to the budget uncertainty. So as you remember, the budget priorities that you passed in last fall that we worked and strategized with in terms of implementation in the governor's proposal did include an investment, some really key investments that are going to still be necessary, and so wanted to contextualize where we are based on some of this lens that you have here. So for the parent fees, that was driven by the fact that our parent fee chart that outlines the parent parent contribution for our subsidy. So if we pay, you know, a percentage of our overall subsidies and parents are expected to contribute, we knew that our parent fee chart was outdated. There was active litigation, class action on it for us. And so really understanding what is the approach that we wanted to do. We have been working with Urban Institute since January. We knew $10 million wouldn't fully cover, as the memo that you all passed reflected, wouldn't fully cover the cost of this, but without known information, we weren't really sure exactly what the total cost might be, but knew that this was going to be an important investment for us to drive equity with families, update our policies and subsidies, and ensure that we were reflecting the needs of providers in that as well. And so we have been working with Urban Institute since January in terms of strategizing and modeling what a new parent fee chart would look like, how we look at that and what the fiscal implications are. As expected, the fiscal implications to date are definitely more than $10 million, but we're still in very much negotiations and conversations and dialogue around like what kind of priorities we set, how that looks, and what that means. So we'll be bringing that back to the board at the next board meeting with some of that, but the financial implications here are that priority still very much holds true, and the choices we make on that will drive the level of investment that's needed. The infrastructure field for the field as well really did look at our staff and the technology needs that we needed to invest in. Obviously, as the demands in our staff have increased, we've taken on more. Those things still very much hold true as priorities for us as we negotiate the year ahead as well. Really, we've completed a technology assessment that helped us understand how and where the priorities should be to become more user-centric, and helping us make these investments wisely over the course of the year, knowing that, again, as we pointed out back last year, that the technology investment was likely needed to be more than this, but that this would give us a pathway towards making sure that we were making improvements along the way. And then finally, we looked at the programmatic investments, and that while acknowledging that those were in need of some further conversation and definition, we have continued to move forward on the quality supports, but that also recognized the need to reconfigure some of our financing for the field, long acknowledged before COVID and made dramatically more apparent as we've confronted the COVID era. And I want, you started to hear about some of those strategies that were underway at the last meeting, but just again noting that actually is woven throughout our budget line items, but was a priority for the board as well. So as the note at the bottom, wanted to put some lens of why these were still relevant priorities for us as we move forward, and happy to answer questions that people have along the way. I'll pause here and see before we move on to how we're grappling with the uncertainty. Any questions, thoughts, concerns?
Feel free to jump in or use the raise hand function. I'll watch for both. It's a little harder with the screen share, so raise hand can be easier.
Thank you. But
just to affirm, I appreciate the lens, and as we've said the whole way through, we don't want to run parallel tracks here. This is going to be a protracted period of time. We've done some great strategic planning and thinking, and so these are also a set of guiding principles for decision making as we continue to go forward.
Yeah. And I apologize about the construction. There won't be a flood, but they're still drilling over our heads.
We're okay. I think it's
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to the next, I can hear it. Moving on to the next slide. So just wanted to highlight some of what is uncertain at this point as we are. Again, this changed slightly as of last week because the governor did put out the revised budget recommendations. So but the governor's proposal earlier in the year did include our priorities set by the board, as you mentioned, as I mentioned earlier. But given where we are in an interim budget. We have 1/12 budgets, and are waiting and knowing that as the governor has proposed revised the revised legislative proposal for the budget, that the legislature is picking that up, and we again have sort of started where we were in January of starting to answer questions and be able to provide additional insight and data of how our line items are being allocated. So in the meantime, moving on to the next slide, I wanted to highlight, and Sean will be able to provide significantly more information along the way if needed, but I wanted to highlight in particular on this one, what we've been doing over the last few months to navigate this uncertainty. So obviously we launched into an FY21 without a budget. I will say, and my colleagues in Illinois will hate the fact that I'm highlighting this, but I lived through multiple years without a permanent budget in Illinois. And I think that I've employed every strategy I can think of from that time that would help protect the field in this. The 1/12 budget have allowed us to be able to make some strategic decisions, but there are trade-offs of making commitments now, that if we do make a commitment now and the appropriation doesn't come through, and that provider or that support service provider has to change their scope, there are significant implications for that provider, for that nonprofit or service provider as well. So we're trying to bridge the gap of making enough commitment that the services don't stop, but not taking decisions that we know are individual entities and stakeholders who are grappling with their own contracts are making decisions, and giving as much transparency around the uncertainty we're faced with, so we don't put people in precarious positions if the legislature passes a budget that doesn't reflect the full extent of our commitments. So in that, we have created shorter contracts so that we could provide more flexibility and be transparent around the question of, okay, if we do a 6-month contract and we need to discuss a change in scope for the second 6 months, that we are making decisions actively with people along the way. And we have anything that people were not planning on for money, we tried to delay at least until we had more certainty about the timing of the budget. And so that was competitive grants or earmarks, which have to be reaffirmed every year. And so for that money, we can't plan on it. And so we wanted to be transparent and make sure that people knew that that wasn't something that, until we got indication of priorities from the legislature, it was hard for us to make sure that we weren't putting people in peril, financial peril, by making commitments we weren't sure if we could keep. So those are some of the things that we have decided to do. And then finally, and then I will open it up for questions as well, wanted to also prioritize those things that were direct services to families and those that impacted direct services to families. So we prioritized our flexibility in our caseload account, so enrollment could be maintained and services for families could be maintained. And you see those things here, and investments in our operations for the supports for those programs, which are becoming increasingly more critical right now, in terms of both physical supplies like PPE, but also the social, emotional, mental health supports that our educators and providers are really needing. And then making sure that we were continuing on some of the critical hires that were underway right before COVID, that were allowing us to actually be more responsive to the field and shift to be more communicative and engaging in a way that could help us collaborate more effectively as we navigate this uncertainty.
Commissioner, Mary Wallachie has a question.
Great.
Commissioner, and thank you. And I couldn't find my hand raising icon, so apologies to everybody. It occurred to me as you were chatting about shorter contracts and month to month, have we had any circumstances where providers have needed lines of credit and letters around, funding, and, what's the situation been there?
Yeah. And two things. One, when I'm referring to contracts, they are not our caseload service contracts. These contracts are more around some of the support service or CCR&Rs where we weren't sure what the need would be this year, and we knew that there might be a change in what the CCR&Rs might need to be doing. So we didn't want to commit to a full year contract knowing that we were in this uncertainty and have them do that. So it's really, we tried to prioritize that in areas that were that would be services surrounding our program, so our programs could remain as stable as possible right now, just so you know. So on that note, though, on what the financial uncertainty is, we haven't, and Sean, jump in if I'll pause if I run there. We have not gotten a lot of direct inquiries about how we could support things like line of credit. I have heard pretty consistently from the field that people are draining their personal savings and accessing lines of credit in order to stay viable during this time. Again, which is why we have prioritized our commitments to trying to help that stability and put funding out to the field so that we don't end up taking more of a hit in childcare than we already have. Sean, I don't know if you have.
To affirm what you said, we haven't heard any requests for line of credit, anything of that nature.
Yeah.
At least I haven't seen it, my team.
So, but that is, I know that anecdotally we've heard that it hasn't necessarily risen to where EEC could support the field so much on that. Any other questions before I move on to some of what we're doing on this? Okay. All right. So moving on to the next slide, and this is where I'm going to add just a little bit more than was on the slide, because we know a little bit more than we did when we did this slide, and the next two slides we'll have a little bit more conversation on this. So looking at the next slide and the interim budget. The interim budget that we've had, we outlined here some of the more specific strategies, and I will outline that and then go to where some of the revised governor's proposed budget highlights for us too. What we really did is just said, like, I wanted to highlight, we have been protecting in our administrative. What you have here on the line item is each of our 3,000 line items. So each of these are what the legislature appropriates to us specifically. Can talk through what it goes towards and how it's allocated by EEC, but really wanted to highlight what we were trying to do to help mitigate the impact on the field while we were looking at each of these line items. So from the administration, that's obviously how our administration of the funding. So we've been prioritizing staff capacity in there as much as possible. To be able to be responsive, not create backlogs, knowing there's a lot of work and additional work not only our team is taking on, but the field is depending on. The quality improvements, we have, as I said, used some, really been deploying those dollars and making sure that for the most part that those are supporting programs and or staff capacity to support programs. But we did delay the UPK recompetition until we understood what that line item would be. Again, knowing that this is a really critical resource for the field, but also really wanting to make sure that we weren't making commitments through a competitive application and wasting a lot of people's time if we weren't sure we'd be able to fulfill that commitment. And in the meantime, making sure that we weren't making trade-offs between a competitive grant and the baseline funding that really programs were needing to rely on, and with this uncertainty, navigating some of that.
Joan has a couple of questions.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm going to try to limit myself just to 2 questions. The first is, with wanting to be conservative, given all of the uncertainty and looking at contracts and earmarks and competitive grants as an area where we're trying to sort of limit exposure to a degree, what does that mean for us in terms of spending in FY20 versus appropriation?
So we don't, for spending in FY20, sorry. I was like, we don't have an appropriation for FY21, yes or no. But for FY20 appropriation, and Sean, jump in the specifics here, I think for our line items, we, aside from a couple, like the career pathways, the higher education opportunities, that was a little bit harder for us to spend in FY20. But for the rest, including our caseload accounts, we did fully expend our appropriation. Sean, do you want to clarify?
Yeah,
exactly?
there's a few cases, like for example, like minor things like an admin where there was a move that was supposed to happen, or reconfiguration that was put off because of the COVID. So there was sort of savings in that area. In caseload, we were actually, based on what we appropriated, we actually overspent by, I think it was like, I have to look at it again, but what, 25 million? That's when we got the supplemental budget later in the year, the 36. Yep. So we did spend the caseload money that was appropriated at the time. And I think the quality count, there was a few contracts that couldn't take off because they got stalled, obviously in March. So there was some reversions. I mean, there's always a little reversion every account, but there was some because really just couldn't get off the ground because of the once March hit.
Yeah, and that was specifically to a couple conferences that our providers were having, or a couple like things that were planned for in person that we couldn't totally revert, we couldn't totally execute in the caseload account. I mean, in the quality accounts. The caseload account, as Sean said, you remember in March, we showed the slide that showed where we thought we might be underspending if we didn't make policy changes. Those policy changes did account for a significant amount of spending, although we didn't get to fully implement them. But taking on the parent fee costs from March through June, as well as emergency childcare costs, is where we overspent that caseload account by about $25 million. And then the supplemental budget that the governor put in at the end of FY20 helped account for that overspend. And then career pathways was the other one we were slightly underspent, but again, circumstances in FY20 where not everyone was able to execute all the activities they thought they would be doing for the end of the year.
So that's really helpful and actually sort of ties into my next area of question, which is within the FY21 context, I really want to take a little time to try to unpack what we know relative to the caseload accounts. When I looked at the proposal, it looked like the center-based rate increase was funded at 10 million in FY21 as compared to 20 million in FY20. And I know that some of the policy changes you referenced meant making some adjustments to rates. I know that you mentioned that we had a $25 million overage in what we spent in FY20 relative to caseload. I know that we had some supplemental funds, we had some PAC funds. So how do we look at the FY21, understanding both some of the assumptions that we were making during FY20 about core components and policy changes that would typically get built in to a maintenance budget? Is that present in the FY21? And then as we look at caseloads and projections and what we understand about need and demand in the field, the fact that so many more families are needing full day slots, the fact that the cost of providing services is much higher, what are we looking at in terms of the FY21 allocation?
Yeah, so let me, I'm going to talk through the FY21 allocation in 1 second. Let me go through a couple of these things that impact that, and then I think we'll can loop back to that specifically because I think that's a really important conversation. I just wanted to highlight that that when we talk about the FY21, that some of our strategies here are reflected in there. So for our caseload account, so I think you meant in the FY21 budget, we hadn't had the full rate increase because we, in the proposed House 2. So I'll talk about the way that the governor's budget proposes the caseload account specifically, because it's a little bit different in the revised proposal. This one, again, the way this all works is the center-based, that all got combined into, the rate increase all combined into the caseload account, so it becomes our total appropriation. So when we were talking about fully expending all of our caseload account for FY20, that is inclusive of that rate, the rate reserve that gets folded into our caseload account. So it's the caseload account plus the rate reserve for FY20 that we were spending, and we were still at $25 million over. But the other thing I wanted to point out is the higher ed. So a lot of these we have again tried to make some obligations where it was directly impacting programs or families, and hedge where we could, so that we could protect the services should we get a cut in the final appropriation. The higher ed in particular, we did engage with a 6-month contract because it was very unclear as to what kind and what the cost of those services might be for the second half of the year. So we have been working with them, understanding, and given that higher ed, how many are virtual, what their enrollment is, what that's looking like, we wanted to make sure that we were designing a scope for the second half of the year that was really doing integrity to the program based on where the appropriation is. So where the governor's House 2, so the governor's, or sorry, I guess it's revised House 2, where the governor's proposed budget from last week does keep us at pretty much at our GAA, our general appropriation from last year. And John can talk through the specifics of that, but there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight in relation to the caseload account. So one of the things that while the appropriation does put us at the House 2 level, which is more than our appropriation for FY20, because as I said, our appropriation for the caseload accounts then had a rate reserve folded into it, a PAC folded into it, was much more. So the caseload accounts that are proposed in the governor's revised budget reflect the House 2 proposal, which is inclusive of that. There is also an outside section that helps put some parameters around a transfer out of that account into a COVID relief fund that should our caseload stay down would put an additional way that we could try to account for that. I think that the challenge that you pointed out, Joan, is that our unknown, and we'll talk about what we know and don't know on the next slide in a second, is that we know our costs are going up. And I think just understanding where and how those costs are going up, given that 50% of our caseload is school age, and that is, we're now paying full day, and it's very hard to project, will that be all year or part of the year, or what that is, the question we have around some of the way that transfer would work is if there would be additional barriers for us to be able to deploy those dollars with the flexibility we need to be able to try to account for money to the field, as Noni, as Charlie so started with. I think that the question that we have, is making sure that we can maximize our dollars. We've been looking, it's very difficult for us to see caseload real time, given that billing doesn't have to happen for a couple weeks after the month, but we've been digging in really as quickly and aggressively as we can, breaking down the information and understanding where we are seeing underspending in our projections or under enrollment, so that we can make critical decisions that will help make sure that those dollars are flowing. And so we are working thoughtfully with the legislature and understanding how we can set up the caseload accounts in a way that ensures that we still can be deploying those dollars on that behalf. I think the other thing that I want to point out that the governor's budget does, and we started to talk about this last time, and we'll continue to talk about this at the next board meeting, but it also does have an outside section specifically for that parent fee component, which allows us, given the way we are this year, we've taken on the cost for parent fees at the cost of $6 million a month that comes out of our caseload account. We've been able to, given the fact that we have some under enrollment and all of that, we've been able to make sure that we continue to stay within our temporary budget appropriation. But what we have been concerned about is the crossroads we're going to be at of whether we continue to be able to afford, the $72 million annual expenditure and $6 million a month on a monthly basis, how long we continue to pay those parent fees versus going back to the parent fee schedule that, as your budget priorities reflected, is not something we were committing to anyway. And so What the outside section allows us to do, as I mentioned, we've been working with Urban Institute, and we will be working on a parent fee model. We have 2. We're looking at about developing 2 more that we can then talk through and bring through priorities, come to some consensus on, and be able to implement a new parent fee model while we're promulgating regulations with you all, as opposed to try to do that and continue the expense, knowing that the regulations have to be far more robust than just the chart. So that outside section allows us to do, which has significant implications on the budget, is implement a parent fee chart that would help reduce our monthly obligation for parent fees, but not take it down to 0. The other because we'll be taking on some of the parent fee expense when we reduce the parent cost in our new model. The challenge is this all comes out of our caseload accounts, and given where all of given where the flexibility we need until we have more of these details and understand where you all will be comfortable with the parent fee model, where our stakeholders externally come back with feedback, it's hard for us to know exactly what the projection will be. So we're seeking to make sure that we don't add any barriers to being able to make quick decisions with you, so we can get that money to providers who, knowing that the loss they're suffering every month is far greater than what our caseload account will afford for anyway. So, Joe, I'm not sure if you have additional questions.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand. So you're saying that the FY21 proposed budget includes rate reserve, includes PAC money, but that there are some additional new pressures on the caseload account, including obligations relative to parent fees that may be new or continuing with some degree of magnitude. Then you also mentioned a COVID relief fund from which some of the caseload funds could be transferred potentially. Is that correct?
Yeah, the governor's budget actually transfers about $85 million into that COVID relief fund, and then proposes that we put an additional plan to how that $85 million would be spent from the House 2 proposal.
And that's $85 million just from the EEC caseload?
Mm-hmm.
That seems like something we're going to want to have additional information and follow up on.
Yeah, I think this is as we've been in conversations with the ANF, certainly the conversation has, we've been asking questions, I think, similar to that of just, where and how do we retain the ability to deploy these funds for what we already know are additional pressures on the budget this year.
I couldn't agree more. I think we have to continue to lift up the principle that the EEC dollars have got to have a very, in my view anyway, I don't want to speak for all of you and I welcome your thoughts, but they have to have a very straight line to supporting a field that is in tremendous crisis with tremendous pressures while trying to maintain mission and service as an essential good in the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this is where we are. I think if we go to the next slide and talk a little bit through our caseload account, I can sort of talk through, I think, Joan, to answer some of your questions around where some of these pressures are, where the knowns and unknowns are, and where, as we look to what projections for the year are, with the big caveat that this is really hard because every modeling for our caseload, I've argued that I think as we looked at in March, our projections around the caseload were not super accurate previously, given the underspend we were having and sort of the challenges we were having at getting an accurate projection to be able to make the policy decisions early enough to make sure there was an underspend in previous years. This year, those models don't even apply, and they weren't necessarily a baseline to work off of in accuracy anyway. So we are really trying to grapple with this. We have brought in, and I can say Sean and his team are deep in data. We spent a lot of time looking at at contracts, and we'll continue and look with you hopefully towards at the next board meeting. We'll have better data. Billing ended last week, so we're just calling through this for September to understand better. Is it the contracts? Is it the vouchers? Like, where are we seeing this, so we can start to understand the barriers for families and make sure we're addressing them. So I wanted to highlight here, what you have here is, again, our actuals for this year, June, July, August. I will give the big caveat that I would not pay too much attention to our this year June actuals or July actuals. There's so much transition as we were reopening childcare, and we did continue to fund people in July based on allowing them the transition month with their families. But as you get into August and September, we become to get more solid as programs have become stable and opened up. So I wanted to be able to highlight a couple things here. One, the September forecast, actually, now that we're 2 weeks later, have a little bit more information on, and we are coming in lower than this. But again, looking into where that is, because some of the trends you're seeing, that we're seeing through our vouchers and contract lens, is that we're seeing our subsidized families, infants and toddlers, are showing up at far lower rates. But DCF seems to be fairly consistent, our DCF enrollment. And so when we look at that, I think we've just been trying to understand a little bit better of where if you think that we're generally at more of a 55,000 number, where is the gap, given how flexible we have made our policies to be able to accommodate family time? We've been asking programs, and in discussion, is this just a question of families not wanting to come back, or are there other barriers that we should be addressing that honestly may have existed pre-COVID, but now that we're in this lens and understanding a different way of looking at the data, we might be able to address and be thoughtful about in the month ahead. But I do want to highlight that when you look at what the money then means, as that for in August, while we are looking at spending less than we did last year, that actually for September, given our projections that so many of our caseload are going from half day to full day, we are, and the fact that we're paying our parent fees and additional policy changes that we've made, we are projecting that we will be, it's a little bit lower than this at this point, given the way the numbers are shaking out from our forecast to our actuals. But as we pointed out, Joan, earlier, that we're not looking to see that we're going to be significantly underspent, even though our caseload account looks different and our makeup looks different. And we are trying to make sure that we're maximizing the enrollment. And ultimately, if we see that we will be underspent, that we have a couple options. One, to try to figure out how we get more kids in, which was certainly our upfront goal, to make sure we were maintaining access during all of this, an upfront goal in July of how do we make our policies as family friendly as possible during this time. But if we are still finding that families can't come back, that the question to Chair Lasso at the beginning is, how do we then make different decisions about deploying these funds to providers so that we are making on behalf of families, so that the childcare system can be sustained and come back in meaningful ways at the other side of this crisis. So I wanted to highlight that and that we are seeing so much shift in our caseload on a day-to-day basis, that our modeling isn't working, but our analysis will come back with you in 2 weeks to be able to do some of that deeper analysis in our caseload account. And I think, to Joan's point, want to continue to have conversations around how you all are thinking about advocating for the structure of the account in a way that helps us achieve the priorities and goals that you set on the impact we want to have with it. I see Sheila had a question. Oh, you're on mute, Sheila.
Sheila, go ahead if you want.
Yes, I'm sorry. When you use the term enrollment, does that describe youngsters actually in attendance or parent intention to have them attend?
Yeah, so this is the parent intention. So for those of you familiar with our CCFA, this is children with a placement. So it means that they are connected to a program in a way that they've chosen the program and enrolling, but we are not projecting based on attendance at all this year. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Other questions? I think, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Joan.
I'm just concerned that, if we're offering sort of broad sort of strategic direction in terms of keeping children and families at the center, in terms of maintaining and supporting programs to operate as effectively as possible during an incredibly, incredibly challenging time, that, we have a lot of variability that we can't fully comprehend. But at the same time, within the budget, I think it's evident that we don't necessarily have enough to get to the place where we can adequately serve more school-age kids for full day consistently with quality, and at the same time accommodate all of the different sort of policy components embedded here. I'm concerned particularly about the 85 million that sounds like it might be going out the door, perhaps for other purposes, and also needing to think about, obviously we need to address parent fees, but we need to find a way to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily diminish our capacity to serve the children and families whom we're aiming to serve. So I think that there are some really key strategic questions embedded in what the FY21 will look like. I just want to put those on the table for a later conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And I think that this is, I think, an important frame as we look at, I think, to the point they're making on how the board engages in the budget, to be able to demonstrate and show those priorities as we look at coming back in a couple of weeks with some updated information and slides. So thank you for that. And I think that's really the tension also with our budget, is with the parent fees, is that, and something we've talked a lot with stakeholders about, is the making sure that that we aren't pulling away from the really critical needed services when we also are making sure those services are affordable and accessible to the families who need them. Carolyn.
Hi.
Oh, we lost you. There you go.
You're just muted. I think you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
That's the charm, right? So I guess I'm just wondering, in terms of the budget discussions, given the fact that EEC continues to take on more and more responsibility because of the fact that schools are a little bit all over the place with regard to openings, is there any discussion about shifting some monies from schools over to EEC during this sort of unprecedented and sort of time, but also with regard to the expansion of a role that's occurred because of a need? And that need is really being fulfilled a lot by EEC in many different ways. And I guess I'm just wondering, so, if one person were taking on responsibilities that somebody else had, there would be a financial shift to accompany that additional responsibility. And I guess I'm just wondering, has any of that come up yet in the budget discussions?
Yeah, it hasn't come up in the FY21 budget conversations. I know communities are grappling with this a lot, and I've gotten a number of requests from superintendents or local communities saying, how can we make this happen? Or what funding might be available for these providers who are taking on these critical roles, particularly superintendent and mayor's office, CEO's office of really trying to think about how to serve families. And I think that that we see some local level coming up with the solution, but I think this is something that I know came up over the oversight hearing this week as well, of really thinking through where the services are happening and how the budget might reflect that. But I'm not aware of any. Maybe the secretary, Chair Lasso, and I can talk with the secretary tomorrow, make sure that we have can communicate the need for that conversation to be part of the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I agree, Carolyn. There's sort of this notion of expanding roles and your kind of notion of backfill, right? Which is, how are we thinking about, it's a zero-sum game in the end. My guess is that there are unexpected costs at the local level on the K-12 side. So I'm in total favor of thinking through, and maybe Commissioner and team sort of quantifying some of these additional costs. Like, how do we think about wrapping our arms around some numbers that might approximate, to Carolyn's point, the expanded role? Yep. And what it costs?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a really interesting question, and the hope is that that we have been providing you data from our survey, our self-reported survey, that I think had been really helpful. We haven't gotten quite a lot of engagement on it yet, so we've been hesitating to bring that data back to you until we got a critical mass of an updated number of providers. But we are seeing through that a few of those real pressing costs that we can aggregate and start looking, things like ratios for school age providers serving remote learners. You know, we have a 1:13 ratio requirement. They're seeing a need for a 1:3 or 4 ratio, which obviously dramatically increases the cost when young learners need someone sitting next to them in order to learn remotely. And obviously with a range of developmental abilities, that is a range of needs from the adult who is available. And so I think that's a thing we're definitely seeing. So we can start to maybe put some numbers behind that. Certainly the increase in PPE costs or operational cleaning costs, hours changing. We are hearing people all over having to do reduced hours to be able to accommodate the kind of increased obligation around cleaning and screening and all of those things that need to happen. So we can certainly try to put a few numbers behind that and be able to try to, again, you know, with the great uncertainty of no one knows what tomorrow's going to hold these days. And so we do end up in a lot of, like, even, you know, there's a lot of adjustments in our billing. So these numbers might change by next week, and we're all just kind of trying to keep up. But I do think that some of those really key, the key things we're hearing are indicators of what might happen. And we definitely should put those out for you all and be able to see that. Yeah. Other questions?
Oh, yeah, Joan has one more question.
Hi, I know that we touched a little bit on EEC administrative capacity, and that the board had initially proposed somewhere in the neighborhood of 13.5 million for capacity building, given how much change is really needed at the agency level in order to adequately support the field and the workforce and make the kinds of changes that we've been talking about and that you and the team have been executing under incredibly challenging circumstances 24/7. And so I saw a very small proposed increase in the 3,000, 1,000 line item, but not in the neighborhood of 13.5. And I just think that we're looking at a future in which EEC is going to have much more capacity and be much more activist to adequately support the field. And while we definitely want to prioritize funding to the field, we also need an agency that's going to be able to interface with the field and many stakeholders that we do. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to what the FY21 proposal looks like relative to EEC's needs and where we all would like to take the agency.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So it does include some continued increase. We had expected to have more hires last year than we actually got through. So those are maintained, but it isn't at the level I think we had anticipated. The need, you know, our licensor caseload, for example, are the highest in the country, and far beyond you know, the national recommended average. And so when you look at some of those questions, I shouldn't say they're highest in the country. They're highest of my scan of country. I don't know that I have every single state's caseload, but given that, like, the questions like that are really critical, because obviously if we can't get out and support people, it's very hard to provide the kind of responsiveness they need during this time to make really, you know, really critical decisions on a day-to-day basis. So it does include some, including continuing the hires that we had planned for last year, and I think we have about 7 or 8 of those left, and then a small modest increase for next year, but not at the level we had anticipated needing. I think that one of the challenges we have, to your point, is trying to figure out exactly what's needed for the right now and what's needed over the long term. And so we're certainly in that, grateful for any investment, but I think also really anticipate needing very different functions and approaches from EEC that will require additional administrative capacity in order to meet those.
So maybe there's something happening here where, you know, there's this question of what is the cost of the expansion? And I'm not saying it would be a perfect science, but, and therefore in this thread, like, what does that mean for what the agency needs? And again, we don't want to run parallel tracks. So I'm not suggesting that you'd want a bunch of admin money for just the COVID moment, but I suspect that some of the admin money that was needed prior is actually a pain point now, such as field operations, right?
Exactly. And I think that's where we're trying to balance, is how do we continue to head towards that, need, that without making the kind of investments that might lock us into something that isn't needed in a year or two. And so we're trying to do some with temporary redeploying, kind of thinking about, you know, what fits in the immediate, but also knowing that we will come as a department, we will be less able to meet the new needs of the field if we don't constantly be thinking about what builds towards that, and that knowing that this field in particular is rapidly evolving to meet, as Carolyn pointed out, needs they didn't know that were going to be needed a year ago. And so really wanting to lead that. So that I think is going to continue to be a conversation we're going to have over the course of the next few months as we try to figure out some of the staffing investments we need to make.
Yeah, well, lots here. And, you know, I think this was a great start to kind of this more ongoing conversation about the priorities, about the spending, about the field's needs, and sort of EEC's current position vis-a-vis the other agencies. And I think we can pick this back up at the November board meeting for sure.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad to hear that. I'm very happy to continue to take feedback on how we can make this dialogue. I think what we were recognizing of the previous conversation is that it wasn't necessarily offering the opportunity to kind of think through where the priorities fit into some of the decisions. And so hopefully we can continue to iterate in a format like this that allows for us to continue to dive into that. And I think grateful to also have some time at the actual meeting, because I think that this is going to be one of the real critical components of our work this year, is figuring out how are we going to finance and what decisions are we making to try to protect this really fragile field. So I think appreciate the dialogue and the partnership on it.
Yeah, and I think we've got to keep thinking about helping the field survive rather than thrive. Like, we're just not there in terms of where things are, despite their tremendous and very best efforts. Yeah. It's a really critical time. So we'll keep in close touch, and look forward to seeing you all in just a couple of weeks. So thank you. Feel free to follow up on any count. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned. Take good care on Zoom.
Yes. Have a good day, everyone.